Edward, a 72-year-old widower, longed for companionship after losing his wife of 45 years. One day, he stumbled upon a vibrant young woman named Anya on an online dating site. Her kind words and sweet gestures rekindled the warmth he'd been missing. Over months, she spun a tale of love and struggle, asking for help during her hard times. Blinded by affection, Edward drained his entire pension to support her. But as his savings vanished, so did Anya, leaving behind nothing but shattered dreams. Edward Barnes sat alone in his modest living room, the ticking of the old wall clock his only company. The house, once lively with family gatherings, now felt silent and cold. It had been 3 years since Clara, his wife of 45 years, passed away after a long battle with cancer. Her absence turned their home into a hollow shell of memories. Every corner seemed to whisper her name, and every photo on the wall served as a painful reminder of the life they had built together. Edward's days were painfully routine. Mornings began with coffee and the local newspaper, afternoons spent half-heartedly tending his garden, and evenings sitting in his favorite armchair, gazing at Clara's photograph on the mantel. The photo, capturing her warm smile and sparkling eyes, felt like a relic of a life long gone. Though his daughter Sarah visited often with her children, Edward knew their time together was fleeting. He loved them, but felt like a burden, unwilling to intrude on their busy lives. One cold October evening, Edward found himself in front of the computer Sarah had gifted him. He rarely used it, feeling too old to learn, but boredom pushed him to explore. He fiddled with the mouse, opening random tabs, unsure of what he was even looking for. As he browsed aimlessly, an ad appeared on the screen. "Find love again. Thousands of seniors are connecting every day." He stared at the screen, his heart torn between skepticism and longing. The thought of companionship, of sharing life with someone, felt impossible yet deeply desired. After a moment of hesitation, he clicked the link. The website was simple enough, asking for basic details: name, age, interests, and a brief description. Edward hesitated before typing. Retired factory worker, widowed, looking for someone to share life's quiet moments. He uploaded a recent photo, one Sarah had taken during a family visit. In it, his silver hair was neatly combed, and his smile, though hesitant, was genuine. For days, there was silence. No messages, no notifications. Edward told himself it was a silly experiment, yet the lack of response stung. Each passing day without a message felt like an affirmation of his irrelevance. He was about to delete his profile when a notification appeared. "You have a message." His heart raced as he opened it. The message was from Anya, a woman with a radiant smile and blonde hair. According to her profile, she was 32, far younger than Edward expected. Her message was kind and simple. "Hello, Edward. I came across your profile, and something about your kind smile touched my heart. You seem like a genuine person. I'd love to get to know you." Edward's first reaction was disbelief. Why would someone like her be interested in him? It had to be a mistake, or perhaps even a cruel joke. Yet, as he reread her message, a flicker of curiosity and hope stirred within him. He typed a cautious reply, thanking her for her kind words and asking what drew her to his profile. Her response came quickly. She was a nurse from Ukraine, working tirelessly to care for her ailing mother. Life was hard, but she believed in kindness and connection. She said Edward's profile exuded warmth and sincerity. Their conversations grew more frequent, and with each exchange, Edward felt lighter. Anya asked about his life, his late wife, and his interests, listening attentively to his stories. She shared her dreams of traveling one day and her struggles with her mother's health. Edward eagerly awaited her messages, checking his computer multiple times a day. The emptiness that had defined his days began to lift, replaced by an unfamiliar yet welcome sense of purpose. Even Sarah noticed the change in him. "You've been smiling more lately, Dad," she remarked during a visit. "What's going on?" "Oh, nothing much," Edward replied, a faint blush creeping across his face. He wasn't ready to share his connection with Anya. It felt too new, too fragile, like a flicker of light he couldn't bear to extinguish. As weeks turned into months, Anya confided more about her struggles. Her mother's condition worsened, and the medical bills mounted. Edward's heart ached for her. Though his pension was modest, he wanted to help. Anya had brought light back into his life. How could he not do the same for her? One evening, Anya mentioned she might have to leave the dating site. "I can't afford the subscription anymore," she wrote. "It's been such a joy getting to know you, Edward. I wish things were different." The thought of losing her was unbearable. Without hesitation, Edward offered to cover her subscription. It wasn't much, he reasoned, and it would keep their connection alive. Anya initially hesitated but eventually accepted, thanking him with heartfelt words and a promise to repay him. Edward felt a deep sense of relief and pride. He believed he was doing something meaningful, helping someone who had rekindled his spirit. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would test his faith, resilience, and trust in ways he never imagined. Edward's days now revolved around his growing connection with Anya. Each morning, he eagerly opened his computer, her messages filling his heart with warmth. Their conversations ranged from light-hearted topics like favorite movies and books to deeper discussions about life, love, and loss. For Edward, it was more than a distraction. It was a lifeline, a chance to feel alive again after years of solitude. Anya shared stories of her childhood in Ukraine, describing summers spent in her grandmother's garden and winters that tested her resilience. She spoke of her dreams to travel, to see places like Paris, Rome, and even Edward's quiet little town. Her messages painted vivid pictures of hope and longing, and Edward often found himself imagining being part of her journey, showing her the hidden joys of his own world. But as their relationship deepened, so too did Anya's struggles. Her mother's health was worsening, and Anya confided in Edward about the mounting medical expenses. "I hate to ask this," she wrote one evening, her words hesitant, "but my mother needs medication we can't afford. If you could help, I promise to repay you as soon as I can." Edward hesitated. His pension was modest, carefully budgeted for his own needs, and he had always been cautious with money. But Anya had become such a vital part of his life. The thought of her in distress was unbearable. After a sleepless night, he made the decision to transfer her the money, telling himself it was a one-time gesture. Anya's gratitude was overwhelming. "You've saved my mother's life," she wrote, her words filled with emotion. Edward felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known since Clara's passing. For the first time in years, he felt needed, like he had a purpose. But the requests didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, Anya shared more difficulties. Her apartment had a sudden leak that required expensive repairs. Her work hours were reduced, leaving her unable to cover basic expenses. Each time, her messages were filled with apologies and promises to repay him once her situation improved. Edward couldn't say no. Her gratitude, her words of affection, and the way she made him feel alive again overshadowed any doubts. Edward's friends began to notice changes in him. During their weekly poker night, Tom, his oldest friend, remarked, "You've been quieter lately. Something on your mind?" Edward shrugged it off with a smile. "Just helping someone who needs it," he said, unwilling to share the details. He knew how it would sound. A man in his 70s sending money to a much younger woman he had never met. But he also knew what Anya meant to him. She was his connection to a world that no longer felt so empty. Still, doubts crept into Edward's mind during the quiet hours of the night. Was he being foolish? Was he blind to something everyone else might see clearly? Yet, whenever he read Anya's messages, those doubts disappeared. Her words were so heartfelt, so full of gratitude, that he couldn't believe her intentions were anything but pure. Then came the day that changed everything. Anya told Edward that her mother's condition had stabilized enough for her to consider traveling to visit him. The idea thrilled him. He imagined walking with her through the park, sharing a cup of coffee at his favorite cafe, and introducing her to Sarah and the kids. It felt like the culmination of months of emotional investment, a chance to bring their connection into the real world. But there was a catch. "I can't afford the ticket," she admitted. "Between my reduced work hours and my mother's ongoing care, it's impossible. If you could help me with the cost, I promise to repay you. I just want to meet you, Edward. I want to see the man who has been my light in the darkness." Edward didn't hesitate. The thought of finally meeting Anya was too enticing. He dipped into his savings and sent her the money, picturing the moment she would step off the plane and into his arms. Over the next few days, he cleaned his house from top to bottom, bought new clothes, and even got a haircut, a rarity for him. When Sarah noticed his renewed energy, he smiled and said, "I might have a visitor soon." But as weeks passed, Edward began to sense that something was wrong. Anya's messages became less frequent, her tone less warm. She mentioned new challenges, delays in arranging her travel documents, complications with her mother's care, and unexpected illnesses. Edward tried to remain patient, reassuring her that he understood, but the nagging feeling in his gut grew stronger. One morning, Edward logged onto the dating site and found that Anya's profile was gone. Her messages, once so vibrant and full of life, were now silent. Panic set in as he tried to reach her through email and social media, but every avenue led to a dead end. It was as though she had vanished. Edward sat at his desk, staring at the empty screen, his heart heavy with confusion and dread. He refused to believe that Anya would simply disappear, not after all they had shared. But as days turned into weeks, the truth became undeniable. He had been left with nothing but memories, and an empty bank account. Edward sat in stunned silence, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keyboard. He refreshed the page repeatedly, hoping Anya's profile would reappear, that this was some kind of glitch. But with each refresh, the sinking realization became harder to ignore. She was gone. The vibrant woman who had filled his days with hope and his heart with affection had vanished without a trace. In the days that followed, Edward clung to a fragile hope that Anya might contact him. He checked his email obsessively, even searching for her on social media. Every attempt led to dead ends. It was as though she had never existed. Edward replayed every conversation in his mind, trying to piece together where he might have gone wrong. Had he said something to upset her? Or was there some tragedy she hadn't shared? As the days stretched into weeks, denial gave way to anger. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and foolish. The savings he had worked so hard to protect were gone, drained by promises and a dream that now felt like an illusion. His pride prevented him from telling anyone the full extent of what had happened. Sarah noticed his growing withdrawal, but Edward dismissed her concerns with vague excuses. "Just tired," he'd say, avoiding eye contact. One evening, Edward decided to confide in Tom during their weekly poker night. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice heavy with shame. Tom raised an eyebrow. "This sounds serious. What's going on?" Edward hesitated, then recounted the story of Anya, how she had come into his life, the connection they had shared, and how she had disappeared without a word. When he finished, he couldn't bring himself to meet Tom's gaze. Tom let out a long sigh, his expression a mix of sympathy and exasperation. "Edward, you're not the first person this has happened to. These online scams are everywhere. They prey on people who are lonely, who just want someone to care about them." "But it felt real," Edward whispered, his voice breaking. "She felt real." "I know it did," Tom said gently. "But these people are professionals. They know exactly how to make you believe. It's not your fault, Ed." Determined to find answers, Edward began researching online scams. What he discovered was both shocking and devastating. Stories of others who had been tricked in similar ways flooded his screen. The tactics were eerily familiar: emotional connections, fabricated hardships, and eventual disappearance. Each story mirrored his own in painful detail. He learned about organizations dedicated to helping scam victims and reluctantly reached out to one, sharing his story with a counselor over the phone. The counselor listened patiently, offering reassurance and resources. "You're not alone," she said, "and while you can't change what happened, you can use your experience to help others." Over the next few weeks, Edward began taking small steps toward rebuilding his life. He deleted his account on the dating site, vowing never to return. He attended a local support group for scam victims, where he met others who understood his pain. Sharing his story, though difficult, brought a sense of relief. For the first time since Anya's disappearance, he felt less alone. One day, Sarah visited and found Edward sorting through old photographs. "What are you doing, Dad?" she asked, noticing a stack of envelopes next to him. "I'm writing letters," he replied, "to people I care about. It's time I reached out." Sarah smiled, her eyes welling with tears. "That's wonderful, Dad. I'm proud of you." Edward's letters became a source of comfort. Each one was a reminder of the connections he still had, the people who genuinely cared for him. Though the pain of Anya's betrayal lingered, it no longer defined him. He was determined to move forward, to reclaim the parts of his life that had been overshadowed by loss. In time, Edward began volunteering at a senior center, helping others struggling with loneliness. His experiences gave him a unique perspective, and his kindness quickly made him a favorite among the residents. He shared his story cautiously, hoping to raise awareness about online scams without dwelling on his own mistakes. The road to recovery was not easy. There were days when the weight of regret threatened to pull him under. On those days, Edward found solace in the friendships he had rebuilt and the support group that had become his refuge. Slowly but surely, he learned to forgive himself. One evening, Edward found himself gazing at a letter he had written to Clara years ago, long before her passing. In it, he had spoken of his hopes and fears and his desire to grow old together. It brought a wave of grief, but also a sense of healing. Clara would have wanted him to find peace, to move forward. As he sat in his garden watching the sunset that evening, Edward felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He thought of Clara, of Anya, and of the person he had become through his struggles. The scars of his past would always remain, but they no longer defined him. He had turned his pain into purpose, reclaiming his life in the process. Months had passed since Edward deleted his account from the dating website. He had worked tirelessly to rebuild his life, reconnecting with old friends and finding solace in volunteering at the senior center. His days were filled with meaningful moments, from organizing activities for residents to lending a listening ear to those who, like him, had faced loss and betrayal. Yet, despite all his progress, the scars left by Anya's deception still lingered. Some nights, he found himself staring at the comp. One afternoon, as Edward prepared to leave for the senior center, his phone buzzed with a new email notification. At first, he paid it little attention, assuming it was spam, but the subject line stopped him cold. "I'm sorry." His heart raced as he opened the message, unsure of what to expect. "Dear Edward, I don't know if you'll read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. My name isn't Anya, and the person you knew wasn't real. I'm part of a group that scams people online. We create stories to build trust and exploit emotions. You were one of my targets. At first, it was just another job, but as I got to know you, something changed. You weren't like the others. You were kind, genuine, and caring in a way that caught me off guard. I started to feel guilty, but by then it was too late. I'd already taken so much from you. I know saying sorry won't undo the harm I've caused. I've left the group, and I'm trying to make amends where I can. I can't give back what you lost, but I hope you find it in your heart to move on and heal. L. Edward read the email over and over, his emotions churning in a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and confusion. He searched the words for sincerity but found only emptiness. "I'm sorry," felt like a shallow echo. incapable of erasing the betrayal and loss he had endured. Unsure of how to process the message, he printed it and brought it to his next support group meeting. As he read the email aloud to the group, a heavy silence filled the room. Margaret, the group counselor, was the first to speak. "It's rare for scammers to admit their actions," she said, her voice calm yet cautious. "This could be an attempt to manipulate you further, but it might also be genuine. What matters most is how you want to handle it." Edward sighed, the weight of the email pressing on his chest. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted. "Part of me wants to think they're sorry, but another part is furious. What does an apology even mean now?" Margaret nodded. "It's okay to feel conflicted. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing their actions. It's about freeing yourself from the grip of this experience." The group's discussion was a turning point for Edward. Some members advised him to delete the email and move on, while others encouraged him to respond for closure. Over the next few weeks, Edward wrote and rewrote responses, each one expressing a different part of his journey: anger, disappointment, and even a sliver of understanding. In the end, he settled on a simple, resolute response. L. I appreciate your honesty, though it comes far too late to undo the harm. I won't forgive you, but I also won't let this define me any longer. I hope you choose to live a better life. Edward. Hitting send felt like shedding a heavy burden. Edward didn't expect a reply, and none came. The silence was oddly comforting, signaling that he had reclaimed control of his narrative. Edward poured his energy into the senior center, where his volunteer work took on new meaning. He started a workshop for residents who had experienced loss or betrayal, sharing his story and encouraging others to find strength in their own journeys. The group grew quickly, becoming a cornerstone of the center's programming. For Edward, each session was a reminder of how far he had come, and how much further he could go. One evening, after a particularly moving session, Margaret approached Edward with a smile. "Your story has helped so many people," she said warmly. "You've turned something painful into something meaningful." Edward nodded, a flicker of pride softening his usually stoic demeanor. "I never thought I'd get here," he admitted, "but it feels good to make something positive out of all this." As Edward walked home that night, the crisp evening air filled his lungs, and he marveled at how much his life had changed. The wounds inflicted by Anya, or whoever she was, still ached, but they no longer controlled him. He had found strength in community, purpose in helping others, and peace in reclaiming his life. That evening, Edward sat in his garden, watching the sky shift from vibrant orange to deep, serene blue. He thought of Clara, of Anya, and of the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. They were reminders of his resilience, his capacity to grow, and the importance of looking forward. As the stars began to twinkle above, Edward whispered a quiet vow: to keep growing, to keep living, not for the past, but for the endless possibilities of tomorrow. Edward's days at the senior center had become a source of pride and comfort. His small workshop for residents dealing with loss or betrayal had grown steadily, attracting people of all backgrounds. Each session was a space for healing, where attendees could share their struggles and triumphs. For Edward, it was a way to give back, to use his own painful experiences as a guide for others. He had found purpose, but he knew he still carried the weight of his past. One day, during a quiet afternoon at the center, Margaret approached Edward with a thoughtful expression. "Edward," she began, "have you ever thought about sharing your story beyond this group? It could help so many people." Edward hesitated. The idea of opening himself up further, of exposing his mistakes and vulnerabilities to strangers, was daunting. "I don't know," he admitted. "What if people judge me? What if they see me as a fool?" Margaret smiled gently. "They might, but they might also see you as brave, as someone who turned their pain into something meaningful. It's your choice, but I think your story deserves to be heard." Her words lingered in Edward's mind. That evening, he sat at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. He thought of the countless people who, like him, had been drawn into the false promises of online relationships. Could his story make a difference? After hours of deliberation, he began to type. Over the next few weeks, Edward poured his heart into writing an article detailing his experience. He recounted his journey with honesty, describing the hope and connection Anya had offered, the betrayal he had faced, and the road to recovery he had walked. He chose his words carefully, ensuring his story was as much about resilience as it was about caution. When the article was finished, Edward submitted it to a popular website that focused on personal narratives. He didn't expect much, but a week later he received an email from the editor. They wanted to publish his story, calling it a powerful testament to the human spirit. Edward's hands trembled as he read the message. Was he ready for this? The article was published a week later, accompanied by a brief note from Edward explaining why he had chosen to share his experience. The response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from readers who related to his story, who thanked him for his honesty and bravery. Some shared their own experiences with online scams, while others expressed admiration for his strength. One message stood out. It was from a man named Paul, who wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to confront what happened to me. I've been carrying this shame for years, but reading your words made me realize I'm not alone. Thank you." Edward read the message several times, his chest tightening with emotion. He hadn't expected his story to resonate so deeply, but it had. The article also brought attention from local media. A journalist reached out asking if Edward would be willing to do an interview. Initially, he declined, wary of putting himself in the spotlight, but after some encouragement from Margaret and the group at the senior center, he agreed. The interview was a nerve-wracking experience, but Edward spoke with sincerity, emphasizing the importance of awareness and community support. The ripple effect of Edward's story was profound. The senior center received an influx of calls from people seeking help and connection. Edward's workshop expanded, becoming a cornerstone of the center's programs. He began collaborating with organizations that supported scam victims, sharing his insights and advocating for better protections for vulnerable individuals. Despite the positive impact, there were moments when Edward felt overwhelmed. Reliving his experience, even in the context of helping others, was emotionally taxing. There were days when he questioned whether he had done the right thing by sharing his story so publicly. But each time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the lives he had touched, the people who had found hope through his words. One evening, as Edward prepared to leave the senior center, Margaret handed him a small envelope. "This came for you," she said with a smile. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman named Clara, coincidentally sharing the name of his late wife. The letter read, "Dear Edward, I wanted to thank you for your bravery in sharing your story. My father was a victim of a similar scam, but he never talked about it. Your words gave me insight into what he must have felt and the courage to forgive him for what he couldn't forgive himself for. You've helped more people than you know." Edward felt tears welling in his eyes. The letter was a reminder that his pain had been transformed into something greater, something that reached beyond himself. That night, as Edward sat in his garden, the stars twinkling above, he reflected on how far he had come. The scars of his past no longer felt like burdens. They were marks of resilience, reminders of the strength he had found in himself and others. He whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, not just for his own journey, but for the connections he had forged and the lives he had touched. For the first time in years, Edward felt at peace, not because he had forgotten the pain, but because he had found a way to use it to illuminate a path forward, for himself and for others. The months following Edward's public story brought him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had become an advocate, a voice for those silenced by shame and fear. His work at the senior center flourished, and his collaborations with organizations to prevent online scams gained momentum. While his days were filled with meaningful activities, Edward often wondered what true closure might feel like. One day, as Edward sat in his garden flipping through old letters, he received a call from an unknown number. Normally, he wouldn't answer, but something compelled him to pick up. "Hello?" he said cautiously. "Is this Edward Barnes?" A calm, unfamiliar voice asked. "Yes, this is Edward." "My name is Detective Graham," the caller continued. "I'm with the Cybercrime Division. We've been following a case related to online scams, and your name came up during our investigation. Would you be willing to speak with us?" Edward's chest tightened. "Of course," he replied. "What's this about?" Detective Graham explained that the group responsible for targeting Edward had been under investigation for months. The email Edward received from L had been genuine and was part of a plea deal from someone who had turned themselves in. They wanted to provide information on the scam network in exchange for reduced charges. Edward agreed to meet with the detective the following day. At the precinct, he was shown photos and documents linking the group to dozens of victims across multiple countries. Seeing the faces of others who had been deceived brought a wave of emotions: sadness, anger, and renewed determination to continue his advocacy. "Mr. Barnes," Detective Graham said gently, "the person who wrote to you has been cooperating. They specifically mentioned you as someone who changed their perspective. Your kindness, even in the face of betrayal, left an impression." Edward was stunned. He didn't know whether to feel vindicated or conflicted. "What happens now?" he asked. "We're building a case to prosecute the ringleaders," the detective explained. "It'll take time, but with the evidence we've gathered, we're optimistic about holding them accountable. I thought you'd want to know your experience has played a part in this." As Edward left the precinct, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Knowing his story had contributed to dismantling the scam network gave him peace. But it also reminded him of how many others had suffered in silence. He resolved to continue his work, not just for himself, but for those who hadn't yet found their voice. Over the next few months, Edward's advocacy took on new dimensions. He began speaking at community events, sharing his experience to educate others about the dangers of online scams. His workshops at the senior center expanded, offering practical advice on recognizing red flags and protecting personal information. Edward's story became a rallying cry, a reminder that vulnerability didn't equate to weakness. One afternoon, Edward received an invitation to speak at a national conference on cybersecurity. The event was attended by experts, policymakers, and victims alike. Standing on the stage, Edward looked out at the audience, a sea of faces filled with curiosity and hope. He took a deep breath and began. "I'm not a cybersecurity expert," he said. "I'm just an ordinary man who made a mistake. But that mistake taught me something valuable. That trust, while precious, can also make us vulnerable. My story isn't just about loss, it's about resilience, about finding strength in community and using pain to create change." The room erupted in applause as Edward finished. The conference marked a turning point in his journey, solidifying his role as an advocate. Media outlets covered his speech, and Edward's story reached even more people, sparking conversations about online safety and emotional healing. Despite his growing influence, Edward remained humble. He continued volunteering at the senior center, where he felt most connected to the people he wanted to help. One evening, after a long day, Margaret approached him with a small gift. "You've come so far, Edward," she said. "This is just a token to remind you of the lives you've touched." Inside the box was a framed photo of Edward surrounded by the members of his workshop, their faces beaming with gratitude. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized how much his journey had impacted others. That night, as Edward sat in his garden under the starlit sky, he reflected on the twists and turns his life had taken. He thought of Clara, of Anya, and of the countless people who had shaped his path. The pain of the past had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something meaningful, a foundation for growth, connection, and purpose. Edward whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for the peace he had found, but for the opportunity to turn his pain into hope for others. The scars of his journey would always remain, but they were no longer burdens. They were badges of resilience, proof of a life rebuilt with courage and compassion. As the cool night air embraced him, Edward smiled, his heart full of gratitude. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, a reminder that even in darkness, light could be found. And for Edward, the light of tomorrow was already shining.